How does a brilliant academic from one of the world's most prestigious universities abandon his Christian upbringing to embrace a faith often misunderstood in the West? This is the extraordinary journey of Dr. Timothy Winter, a Cambridge University lecturer whose intellectual pursuit led him down an unexpected spiritual path. What profound revelation could compel this respected British scholar to not only change his religious beliefs, but also adopt a new name, Abdal Hakim Murad, and become one of the most influential Western voices in Islamic scholarship? Born on May 15, 1960, in London, Timothy Winter grew up in a family with Christian foundations. His early education was marked by exceptional intellectual ability, eventually leading him to academic distinction. Winter's scholarly pursuits took him to the hallowed halls of Cambridge University, where his analytical mind and rigorous approach to theological questions earned him recognition among peers and mentors alike. In his early academic career, Winter displayed little extraordinary interest in religion beyond academic study. While he had a cultural affinity with Christianity through his upbringing, his relationship with faith was primarily intellectual rather than deeply spiritual. His colleagues knew him as a promising scholar with a bright future in Western academia. "I was essentially a product of British education and culture," Winter would later reflect. "Religion was something I understood primarily through the lens of Western intellectual tradition." As his reputation grew, few could have predicted the profound transformation that awaited this Cambridge intellectual. His command of languages, historical contexts, and theological frameworks positioned him as an emerging voice in comparative religious studies, a foundation that would later serve him in unexpected ways. Winter's first meaningful encounter with Islam came during his time in Cairo in the early 1970s. What began as an academic sojourn into Middle Eastern culture soon became something more profound. The daily rhythms of Muslim life in Egypt's ancient capital captured his attention in ways he hadn't anticipated. What struck me initially was how the spiritual life was so thoroughly integrated into everyday existence. Winter later recalled, "Throughout Cairo, you would hear the Quran being recited on radios nearly all day. People would stop what they were doing to pray. There was a spiritual coherence to life that I found fascinating." Initially, Winter approached these observations with academic detachment. His Western intellectual framework provided ready explanations for religious phenomena as cultural expressions or social constructs. Yet something about the serene certainty he witnessed in ordinary Egyptians challenged his academic skepticism. "I began to wonder if my presumption that the modern Western worldview represented the pinnacle of human understanding was perhaps flawed," he said. These people lived with a spiritual certainty that seemed to transcend mere cultural conditioning. The intellectual challenge that would ultimately transform Winter's life was taking root, a question of whether the secular materialism of his Western education truly represented the full spectrum of human knowledge and experience. As Winter began to study Islamic theology more seriously, he encountered a theological elegance that challenged his preconceptions. The Islamic concept of Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, struck him with its logical coherence and philosophical depth. "The more I studied Islamic theology, the more I was struck by its intellectual consistency," Winter explained. "The concept of Tawhid, that God is absolutely one without partners or divisions, has a powerful logical coherence that I found compelling." This contrasted sharply with Christian theological concepts he had long taken for granted. The Trinity in particular began to pose difficult questions for Winter. He increasingly wondered about the historical development of Christian doctrine and its divergence from the strict monotheism of Jesus' own teachings as recorded in the Gospels. Winter discovered that the Quran specifically addresses Christians about the Trinity. "O people of the book, commit no excesses in your religion, nor say of Allah anything but the truth. Christ Jesus the Son of Mary was no more than a messenger of Allah. Say not Trinities desist. It will be better for you. For Allah is one God." Quran 4:171. "I was stunned to find that the Quran directly addressed the very theological question I was struggling with," Winter recalled. "Even more surprising was discovering that when I returned to the Gospels with fresh eyes, Jesus' own words seemed to support the Islamic understanding of God's oneness, rather than later Trinitarian formulations." The discovery that shook Winter most profoundly was his realization that the concept of the Trinity was not directly taught by Jesus, but rather developed over centuries after his time. This historical understanding of doctrinal development raised serious questions about the foundations of his inherited faith. Winter's discoveries created profound internal conflict. As his study of Islam deepened, so did his questions about Christian doctrines he had previously accepted without serious examination. I found myself in an intensely difficult position intellectually, Winter later explained. The rational coherence of Islamic monotheism stood in stark contrast to the theological complexities I had been taught to accept in Christianity. If Jesus himself emphasized God's oneness, as the Gospels record, how had we arrived at such a different understanding? The conflict extended beyond theological questions. Winter began to see Western secular modernity in a new light, questioning its claims to universal validity. Islam seemed to offer a holistic worldview that integrated spiritual and material aspects of life without the secular religious divide he had taken for granted. When Winter cautiously began sharing his investigations with academic colleagues, the responses ranged from dismissive to concerned. Many saw his growing interest in Islam as a puzzling intellectual detour rather than a serious theological pursuit. There was an assumption that any Western intellectual who showed genuine interest in Islam must be engaging in some form of exotic academic tourism, Winter reflected. The possibility that Islam might have genuine answers to profound theological questions was almost unthinkable within mainstream Western academic discourse. Winter attempted to resolve his doubts by exploring alternative theological explanations within Christianity. He studied different denominations, Eastern Orthodox perspectives, and historical Christian movements that emphasized God's oneness. Yet none provided the theological clarity and historical consistency he was finding in Islamic teachings. The more I explored, the more isolated I felt, he acknowledged. I was moving into intellectual territory that few in my academic circle could understand or appreciate. As the contradictions between his deepening understanding of Islam and his Christian background intensified, Winter faced a profound intellectual and spiritual crisis. The faith of his upbringing seemed increasingly difficult to reconcile with the historical evidence and logical consistency he valued as a scholar. I reached a point where intellectual honesty demanded I confront the implications of my research, Winter recalled. If the evidence suggested that Islam preserved the pure monotheism that Jesus himself taught, while Christian doctrine had evolved in different directions, what did that mean for my own beliefs? For months Winter lived in this state of intellectual turmoil. He intensified his study of both Christian and Islamic sources, comparing their theological frameworks, historical development, and internal consistency. He particularly focused on the historical Jesus and the earliest Christian communities, looking for connections between their beliefs and Islamic teachings. His historical investigations revealed that early Jewish Christian groups like the Ebionites held beliefs about Jesus that were much closer to Islamic understanding than to later Trinitarian Christianity. They viewed Jesus as a prophet and messenger of God, not as divine himself, a perspective remarkably similar to the Islamic view. I discovered that what is now considered Orthodox Christianity was not necessarily the original understanding of Jesus among his earliest followers, Winter explained. Many early Christians appear to have maintained a strict monotheism that would be more recognizable to Muslims than to modern Trinitarian Christians. Winter also found himself questioning the Christian concept of atonement, the belief that Christ died to redeem humanity's sins. The idea that God would require the sacrifice of an innocent to forgive sins began to seem inconsistent with divine justice and mercy. When I saw the Passion of the Christ depicting Jesus' suffering to atone for others' sins, I couldn't help but question what this implied about God, Winter said. Why would a merciful God require such suffering from an innocent person rather than simply forgiving sinners directly? Islam's understanding that each soul bears responsibility for its own actions, and that God's mercy is directly accessible to all who sincerely seek it, began to seem more consistent with divine justice and compassion. At his moment of deepest crisis, Winter realized that his entire worldview was shifting. As a scholar committed to intellectual integrity, he couldn't ignore where his investigation was leading him, yet embracing these conclusions would mean a profound transformation of his personal and professional identity. I realized I was standing at a crossroads, he recalled. I could either retreat into comfortable familiarity and avoid the implications of what I had discovered, or I could follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of personal consequences. Driven by his commitment to intellectual honesty, Winter began seeking deeper understanding of Islamic practice, not merely Islamic theology. He started visiting mosques, not as an outside observer but as someone genuinely seeking to understand the faith from within. I wanted to see if the theological coherence I found in Islamic texts translated into lived spiritual experience, Winter explained. I began meeting with imams and scholars, asking questions not to challenge but to understand. What impressed Winter was the integration of intellectual rigor and spiritual practice he found in traditional Islamic scholarship. The scholars he met weren't simply academics studying texts, they embodied a living tradition that unified knowledge and practice. As his understanding deepened, Winter found himself particularly drawn to Islamic spirituality, the tradition of tasawwuf or Sufism. Here was a dimension of Islam that spoke to the heart as well as the mind, offering a path to spiritual knowledge through both intellectual understanding and spiritual disciplines. In Sufism, I found a profound spiritual psychology that acknowledged both human weakness and the soul's potential for transformation, Winter noted. It offered not just theological propositions but practical methods for spiritual purification and growth. The decisive moment in Winter's journey came not as a sudden epiphany, but as the culmination of years of intellectual and spiritual searching. The accumulated weight of evidence and experience gradually led him to embrace Islam, not just as an intellectual proposition, but as a comprehensive way of life. My conversion wasn't primarily emotional or social, Winter would later explain. It was, in essence, a recognition that Islam preserved the original message of Jesus and all God's prophets, the call to recognize the oneness of God and to submit one's life to divine guidance. Winter formally embraced Islam, taking the name Abdal Hakim Murad, signifying not just a religious conversion, but a transformation of identity. This name change represented his integration into a tradition that he had come to believe preserved the essential message of all divine revelation. Winter's conversion to Islam created ripples throughout his personal and professional life. In the academic world, reactions ranged from curiosity to dismay. Some colleagues respected his intellectual journey, while others questioned whether his objectivity as a scholar had been compromised. There's an unspoken assumption in Western academia that genuine scholars maintain a certain distance from religious commitments, Murad observed. Converting to Islam, particularly for someone in theological studies, challenged that paradigm. Some viewed it as crossing a line from studying religion to being captured by it. Professional consequences were subtle but significant. Certain academic pathways became less accessible, while new ones opened. Rather than advancing through conventional academic channels, Murad found himself increasingly playing a bridging role between Islamic and Western intellectual traditions. In his personal life, the conversion created varying degrees of tension. Family members struggled to understand his decision, seeing it as a rejection of shared cultural heritage rather than a sincere spiritual journey. It was difficult for some family members to understand that embracing Islam didn't mean rejecting Christ or Western cultural values, Murad explained. In fact, I came to see myself as recovering an authentic monotheistic tradition that included Jesus rather than abandoning him. The broader social context of growing Islamophobia in the West added another layer of complexity. As a visible Western convert to Islam, Murad sometimes found himself navigating misunderstandings and prejudices he had never experienced before. Suddenly I was experiencing aspects of British society I had been previously insulated from, he noted. It gave me insight into the challenges faced by the Muslim community and the deep misunderstandings about Islam prevalent in Western society. Despite these challenges, Murad remained steadfast in his conviction. The intellectual and spiritual coherence he found in Islam continued to confirm his decision, even as he navigated its social and professional consequences. As Abdal Hakim Murad, Winter began building a new life that integrated his Western academic background with his Islamic faith. Rather than abandoning his academic roots, he leveraged his unique position to build bridges between Islamic and Western intellectual traditions. I came to see that my background gave me a unique perspective, Murad explained. I could articulate Islamic concepts in ways that made sense to Western audiences while helping Muslim communities engage confidently with modern challenges. Murad's scholarly work expanded to include translations of classical Islamic texts, commentary on contemporary issues from an Islamic perspective, and efforts to revive traditional Islamic scholarship. His fluency in both traditions allowed him to interpret each to the other with unusual insight. One of his most significant contributions was founding the Cambridge Muslim College, an institution dedicated to training imams and Muslim leaders who understand both Islamic tradition and contemporary Western context. The college represented Murad's vision for an Islam that engages confidently with modernity without losing its traditional roots. Muslim communities in the West need leadership that is both authentically rooted in Islamic tradition and conversant with contemporary challenges, Murad stated. The college aims to nurture scholars who can navigate both worlds without compromising either. Murad's unique position also made him an important voice in interfaith dialogue. His intimate knowledge of Christianity and Islam allowed him to identify common ground while honestly acknowledging differences. He became respected not just within Muslim communities but in broader interfaith circles. Islam didn't separate me from my past, it gave me a new perspective on it. Murad often explained, I discovered that the Quran itself calls for respectful dialogue with Christians and Jews as fellow people of the book, recognizing our shared spiritual heritage. As his influence grew, Murad's articulation of a traditionally grounded but contextually aware Islam offered an alternative to both religious extremism and secular assimilationism, a middle path that honored tradition while engaging thoughtfully with contemporary realities. The journey of Timothy Winter to Abdal Hakim Murad represents more than a personal religious conversion. It embodies an intellectual and spiritual bridge between traditions often perceived as separate or opposed. The path of sincere seeking will always lead to unexpected destinations, Murad reflects. What began as academic curiosity led me to discover that Islam offered not just theological clarity, but a comprehensive way of living that integrates faith, reason, and spiritual practice in daily life. Murad's story challenges simplistic narratives about religious identity and cultural belonging. His life demonstrates how intellectual honesty and spiritual seeking can transcend conventional boundaries, creating new possibilities for understanding across traditional divides. What truths might we discover if we follow the evidence beyond our comfort zones?